Daniel's son.
Daniel's son. Did we do that last time?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to do it every week.
It's later than I thought, so we must be having fun. So here's a couple of emails that I wanted to go through real quick.
Hate mail.
This wasn't hate mail, unless I'm missing something here. But these are in regards to the Rawlins Rodeo murders that we covered a couple weeks ago. This first one is from someone that says, I learned about your podcast on Facebook. This is someone who grew up in Rawlins, Wyoming, and says that her mother also grew up in Rawlins, and she knew Carleen Brown. She was one of the victims.
I think I got a message maybe on Instagram or maybe it was on Facebook about this.
She says that her mother and Carleen were the same age and grew up together. She says she grew up hearing the story that my mom was invited to the fair that day with Carleen, but she was newly married and pregnant with her, the person writing this email, at the time, so she declined to go with Carleen Brown, which we both know that Carleen Brown and her friend were at some point come across a bad person.
Right.
And we end up finding the body of one of the victims so many years later, but Carleen Brown has never really been accounted for. Now, she says that I heard other stories about Carleen while I was growing up. She was kind of a, quote, wild child. And my mom said she was gone a couple of weeks before anyone tried very hard to look for her because it was not out of character for her to run off from her dad's house in Rawlins to her mom's in Colorado Springs when she was upset with one parent or another. I think we talked about that a little bit when we covered it.
Right.
The author of this email says she's never heard of this dude, Royal Russell Long, who you and I believe is probably responsible for several of these abduction and murders. Says that I don't think that news of his other crimes and arrests ever made the rounds in Rawlins, but cannot say for sure. She goes on to say that my mom never knew the girl that was with Carleen when they disappeared and whose remains were found. That seems odd to me since it was such a small town and my mom was invited to go along that day. So they should have all been from the same social circle. You know, it was an extremely small town. And she's saying, my mom doesn't know who this other person is.
Possibly, but then if she is a quote-unquote wild child, then is she meeting somebody there? Did they become friends at the event? Mm-hmm. Did they go together?
Or did this other friend go in place of someone who was already invited that could not go?
Right.
And then they say, my husband grew up in Rawlins as well. When he was in second or third grade, it would have been 1979 or 1980, one of his classmates was abducted and murdered. Her name was Renee Davidson, if you want to look it up. During those years when we were in elementary school, I remember we were all afraid of a man named Della Pina. We were generally suspicious of anyone who drove a van. She says, I think his name was probably more like De La Pina or Della Pina, something like that.
Right. Hashtag ban the van.
I don't know if he was a known suspect or a known serial killer or what. Perhaps it was discovered he killed Renee and everyone knew it.
Right.
Later, when we were in high school in the late 80s, early 90s, another one of my husband's classmates was abducted and murdered. Her name was Lisa Marie Peterson. She says, telling you all of this now makes me realize that's a lot of girls murdered from one tiny little town.
Right.
Also, I have to say, having lived in Rawlins for 30 years and being third generation born here, I was a little annoyed that you were annoyed at the information you couldn't get a hold of to piece together your stories, especially in part one. You sort of painted the locals out to be inept at investigation, but that was a different time. Too bad you didn't ever get to come to Wyoming to get a real feel for the little towns because you make a lot of assumptions to fill in the gaps. You suggested that the newspaper could have buried some of the news about the other little Montana girl being killed, but I highly doubt it. In a small town where everyone knows everyone's business, That said, it happened only 1 month after Carlene, and my mom has no recollection of her name or event. So that's interesting because I do agree with the person that sent this email, and I won't give out her name, but I do agree with her. I can get how I may have come across a little accusatory about the town or whatever regarding that there was no information on Deborah Meyer was her name.
When do you not come off like a dick?
Well, I did respond to her, and I simply stated that Deborah Meyer thing. Not only did it annoy me, but it annoyed me to the point where I thought something very suspicious was going on there, something very fishy. And what I mean by that is, look, I'm pretty good at doing the research on some of these cases. Humble brag there, right? But
yeah,
if there's a missing person, a believed to be murdered child that happened in the U.S. within the last 50 years, if you can't find a decent amount of information about it, or at least more than what we found in Deborah Meyer's situation, it just seems very strange and fishy to me. I mean, years ago we covered Tony Muncie, and that was a Columbus case here. And one reason why we were passionate about covering that case was because there was so little internet information about Tony Muncie's case.
Right. But again, you're in Columbus, so you can do more digging, and then you find, hey, there's a bunch of stuff just not on the internet. And kind of like what I said when we're covering the case, chances are there is a bunch of information. They probably covered this story multiple times. They just never transferred that information onto the internet.
Yeah, and the thing with Tony Muncie is, as little as there was about his case on the internet at the time when we covered it, there was still quite a bit more than what was found, what we were able to find on Deborah Meyer's case, the little girl from Montana. And I mean, that was just surprising to me. Everyone out there, if you want to check into it, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, as much as I could find was basically a paragraph that was on multiple websites, and it's pretty much the same paragraph. There's no additional information when you go from one website to the other. And the other thing too was it was kind of listed, in my opinion, as an oh by the way case, because a lot of times where I would find information about Deborah Meyer, it would be from looking into the other possible victims when we discussed the Rawlins Rodeo murders. But to my credit, and to kind of back up my statement that we gave in part 1 there, she says, look, my mom grew up with these people, and I told her the name of that Montana girl who went missing that that I was complaining about. And she says, my mom doesn't remember that name, nor does she even remember hearing about that abduction or the girl going missing.
Yeah, but it's kind of weird though, because especially in that small town, it's going to be kind of like the Kennedy assassination. Where were you when? Yeah. Kind of like here for at least rock fans or metal fans, it's kind of like you remember where you were or what you were supposed to be doing the night that Dimebag Darrell was killed at the Alarosa Villa. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like this lady has a story of, my mother was supposed to go.
Right.
Now, it's a little different because my mother was supposed to go with this girl that went missing. But I'm sure with your friends, one of my friends contacted me, or maybe it was like 2 days before. It was like, hey, Dimebag Darrell's playing at the Alarosa. Mm-hmm. And I was like, with who? Damage Plan. Don't know if I want to go.
Right.
But then my buddy's like, yeah, but it's Dimebag Darrell. At least we get to say that we saw him, in person, in concert. And we're like, okay, maybe. Mm-hmm. And he never called. And then, like, when the shooting hit the news waves, he calls and says, hey, we almost went there. I'm like, yeah, we did. So it kind of reminded me of that. Anyways, at least that sparked in my mind.
So that's where were you when that happened? You in reference to Dimebag being killed.
Where were you?
I didn't go to the show, thankfully. Lucky enough to not have gone to the show. I was kind of same situation as you. I knew that they were playing there that night, and I always liked Dimebag, and I always liked Vinnie Paul is the drummer, who I believe it was Dimebag Darrell's cousin as well. And they were
Was
in
it cousin or brother?
Maybe it was brother. Regardless, they were related.
Right.
And they were both in Pantera together. I liked Pantera, but I had seen Pantera live before, so I wasn't really motivated to see Damage Plan. Plus, around that time, too, I wasn't going to concerts as much. You know, as I started getting a little older, I started going to fewer concerts, but I was going to better concerts, if that makes sense. Like, you know, you could see a lot of shows for $10, $15, $20, you know, and I would go to a lot of them when I was young. As I got a little older, I'd see better bands at bigger venues, bigger ticket prices, but only go a couple times a year. Now, in regards to where I was, I can't say where I was that night, and I don't remember anyone inviting me or asking me to go. But the next day, I worked at a restaurant that was about, I'd say, a mile from the Alrosa Villa where the shooting took place. And in my section, I kept getting a lot of younger kids, which was weird to get that at like the lunch hour during the week, because I feel like that concert would have been like a Wednesday night or Thursday night maybe. And
yeah, I remember it being a weird night.
So I kept getting tables full of these, of like 19 and 20-year-olds that were dressed like they were going to an Alrosa Villa show. And I ended up, and they looked like they had been up all night. Like I was like, man, I'm getting some rough looking tables. Yeah. And so I asked, somebody was kind of consoling somebody else at the table with them. And I felt bad. So I was like, oh, you know, you guys having a bad day? Is everything okay? You know, anything I can do? Just trying to, you know, break the ice a little bit. And they told me what happened. I didn't know until right then and there.
Right.
And I was like, oh, man, you know, I'm kind of floored, so I didn't really know what to say. But they were explaining to me that they were just like tired and starving. They'd been up all night, and it was because after the shooting took place, the police and medics and everybody was checking everybody out, but the police were also getting questions, you know, asking questions and getting eyewitness accounts to kind of really piece together what happened.
Right. And then I think really after then, right away, a lot of people started going to Alrosa to mourn the situation.
Yeah.
Because we played there a lot when we were in a band in high school. So we were there. And not only were we at the Alrosa a lot, but we were in every part of Alrosa. The stage, backstage, some areas that most people wouldn't have been if they've even just seen a show there. And so it was kind of surreal because when you watch the video footage of that, you could see, like, you know, that stage, you know, any camera angle that they had, at some point you watched a show at that angle. Because if you're the headlining band, maybe you're watching the opening bands on the side, or after you got done playing, you're watching the headlining band from the side. So, yeah.
Well, and we loosely knew the owner. I mean, we didn't know him outside of the Alrosa, but we knew him from playing there and talking with him behind the scenes. Rick Catella, the rock and roll reverend, who was locally was kind of famous for his commercials when we were kids. You know, he had the. I'm not going to attempt to do his voice,
but that's when you thought you made it, when you were in a high school band, and he would say, "This is Rick Catella, the rock and roll reverend of the Alrosa Villa.
Tonight."
Yeah, tonight. I mean, Friday night. And then he'd say your band name, and you'd go, "Oh my God, we made it."
His commercials, which, I mean, fantastic, his delivery and his voice, but his commercials, it was like you would hear it on the radio between heavy metal songs and hard rock songs on a local station here. And it was like a guy that was introducing a monster truck rally or a NASCAR, big time NASCAR event or heavyweight championship fight. I mean, he had that voice and those pipes and a great delivery. Tonight, you know, and you'd get, you would get pumped up, especially if you were going to the Alrosa to see a band that you liked, and you would hear it on the drive up Because remember, it was a bit of a drive for us when we were 16, 17. It felt like a long drive, and it doesn't anymore.
At the most, it would have been like maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes.
Right.
But back then, it felt like you're going to another world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people have been saying that we should release our music for sale, our high school band's music for sale on the web on the website.
So if I remember correctly, so Rick Catella, his parents owned Al Rosa Villa.
Right.
And the name comes from his father's name was Al, his mother's name was Rosa. And so that's how they get the name. And some of his, I don't know if they were brothers and sisters or cousins, but there were a lot of people that looked like Rick Catella that worked in the bar.
They didn't look like him, but they looked like they could be related.
Right. I think one of the bartenders was his brother, and I think the lady, remember the mean lady that worked the door?
They were always nice to me. Everybody would always talk about, oh, this person's mean, or always nice to me.
I only had a problem with the lady that worked the door for whatever reason. It was probably my fault. I shouldn't say she was mean. I can't remember the situation, but I think that was his sister.
I was joking about you being a dickhead before, but you were definitely more of a dickhead back then.
So I don't know if I ever told you this story, and we'll get back to the Rawlins Rodeo murders here in just a second, but I want to make sure I tell you this while I'm thinking about it. So a few years, probably 2 years after Dimebag was killed at the Al Rosa Villa.
Right.
Now, mind you, how many people were, that was a public shooting for those of you that aren't aware.
Yeah.
The perpetrator, he was killed by a police officer that came in and saved the day. I mean, because who knows how many other victims and fatalities would have been that night.
Oh, it would have been bad. It would have been very bad.
But
if you watched the footage, you would realize that if that cop never showed up, it would just been maybe 100.
Well, the guy, the shooter, had every intention of not just shooting the guys on the stage, but also firing into the crowd. Yeah. And I bumped into, remember Daryl, the sound guy?
Yeah.
He would do sound for us, and he did sound for a lot of people. And sometimes the national acts would bring in their own sound guy. But Daryl was, if he was in a good mood, which
was never.
Well, some nights he partied too much and the sound wasn't great. But if he didn't party too much, I thought he was a pretty quality sound guy. So I went to a place called the High Beck, which gets its name because it's on the corner of High and Beck. And I used to work second shift near there at the property downtown, security administrator. And I would go in there some nights, usually on like a Thursday after my shift was over. So it'd be pretty late, like 11 o'clock at night by the time I'd walk in. And he was sitting on a stool at the bar, and I didn't recognize him at first. It's a long bar, so I walked past him. His back would have been to me.
Right.
And he saw me and he goes, "Oh," and I don't remember if he remembered my name right away or if it came to him shortly afterwards, but he called me over. And so we sat there and talked old war stories all night as we drank. And then I brought up the shooting, which I probably shouldn't have, but
well, you're a dick.
but I mean,
this is just proving my point. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't I though?
I'm just joking.
We knew each other. He worked there, and I just was like, I don't even think I brought it up to get his opinion or hear his
story. Right.
I really just brought it up as oh man, that was horrible. I heard about that, and I feel bad. And dude, like I got through like one sentence, and he broke down on me. Yeah. Broke down on me, started crying, and gave him a few hugs, and we talked it out, and it was certainly a horrible thing for all involved, a horrible thing for the city, but then talking to people that were there, I mean, that was the only time that I did. And he told me, he said the Catella family almost shut down the place, and I think they temporarily
They
shut
did
it down
full
for
on.
a long time?
So here's some information for you. On December 8th, 2004, Damage Plan was on tour. A guy named Nathan Gale, which was a former Marine, 25 years old. He jumped the fence, which there was a patio, and the fence was tall. This fence was 6 feet tall. He jumps the fence. He gets on stage. He shoots Daryl in the head 5 times. He has a 9mm Beretta M9. Daryl was pronounced dead at the scene. He's going to kill 3 others and wound 7 more. Jeff Mayhem Thompson, which was the head of security, went right after he shot Dimebag. He went right after him, and he got killed. Alrosa employee Aaron Hawk was also killed, and an audience member, Nathan Bray, which was a Grove City alumni, and a guy that came to our shows a bunch, a kid that I actually played baseball with for many years and loved the guy to death. He's a short guy, but if you watch that footage, Dimebag is shot and Dimebag collapses, and at some point Nathan jumps on stage to try to help him, and he gets shot right in the chest. And like I said, there was 7 other people wounded. Now there was roughly 250 people at the show.
Yeah.
And they had 2 other bands, 2 local bands that were supporting the show. But yeah, Nathan was this awesome guy, and he went to the show with a guy I grew up with, Josh Drake, which was a really good guitar player. And Josh came into the place I worked right afterwards, and we just talked guitars for a while. And then all of a sudden, he brought up the shooting. He was there. He went with Nathan, and when he told me the story, I mean, he just kind of zoned out for a minute, and it was really hard to listen to because that's this guy's friend. I mean, Nathan was my friend too,
right?
But they would come to when we played in our band Ground War. They would come watch us play, and Nathan would always go, "Oh yeah, it was pretty good," but oh no, he would always say it's pretty good for sissy music, or he'd say it's pretty good for boy band music. It was always something because he really liked, he'd kind of bust your balls, and then he'd say, "Oh no, I like you guys," but he'd like really, really heavy music, and even though we're like heavy, like. He was like, "Nah, it's not heavy enough." Like, and it was every show, but he'd go to a bunch of shows and support and buy our records. And like I said, I played baseball with him for multiple years. So just what a tragedy of Columbus, Ohio.
Well, and you know what? It was such a shocker for me when it happened that I purposely didn't read any of the newspaper accounts. I didn't watch any of the news coverage. I kind of just avoided it. You know how sometimes things hit you real hard and you're just not ready to deal with it. And so I kind of tried to block it out in the beginning and didn't really pay any attention to it. And I think it must have been about 6 months later, some TV channel did like a 20-minute, 30-minute story on it.
Right.
And they gave the whole rundown of what took place and how it all went down. And what was a stunner for me was you mentioned the shooter jumped the fence, and this was like you said, 6 foot tall, maybe taller, 7 foot tall privacy fence.
Right.
That was created so that they would have a patio. And the Alrosa, I thought, was a pretty cool setup the way that they had everything, because 250 people, 300 people, really good sound. It was a place that had a small feel, but it held a few hundred people. And they would have these 2 doors on the sides that went out to this patio area. If you remember when we were young and we first started playing there, that patio area didn't exist. That was like part of the parking lot. And the problem when we were younger at the Alrosa was they would pack so many people in there, and it would get so damn hot in there by like the second band. Like that place never had to turn on the heat, because remember we'd show up for like sound check and bringing in the equipment and stuff, and it would be frigid in there. Right. It would be cold, and you would be like, "Oh man, how are we gonna play in here?" It's like it feels like it's 40 degrees. And by the time the second band would go on, it felt like it was 90 or 100 degrees in there because all the lights, all the equipment, all the people.
Yeah.
And that patio area was great because you'd watch a band and then everybody would flock out to that patio because they needed a breather.
Right.
They needed a breath of fresh air. And that guy scaled that privacy fence, went in through one of the side doors, and watching the account on that show of how everything went down, it was another stunner for me because I always just assumed that the shooter went in the back door. Remember how, like, when bands were playing, it wasn't uncommon for the back door to be open.
Right, or cracked.
Yeah, because it was so hot in there that they would just kind of leave it open, and it was a door that I don't know if you had to physically lock it or if it just locked behind you. But a lot of the band members and roadies and stuff and security would go in and out of that door kind of constantly throughout the night, so it was always just cracked or propped open.
Yeah, and anybody could go through that door, but it was kind of known, like, if you're not a part of the band, don't go through that door. So
yeah, and to give you an idea of how often that door was just like left open, that's why I always thought that's where he entered the building from. I remember Deftones played at the Alrosa, which was a big deal, and I don't remember what tickets were, but for whatever reason, me and my buddy, I think it just sold out so fast that me and my buddy couldn't get tickets to it, and we really wanted to see Deftones. So I told him, I said, he was all, upset that he was down that we weren't going to get to see him. And I said, look, man, it's not going to be as good as seeing him, but that door, the door to the back of the building that goes right behind the stage is always open. It's always cracked. Let's just drive up there and we'll just sit by that door and listen to the band, listen to Deftones that way.
Yeah. And what's crazy about this whole situation too is Nathan Gale was actually in an altercation with the band 6 months prior in Cincinnati, in which he damaged like $5,000 worth of equipment and had to be removed from stage by security. And it was all this stuff about like that Dimebag Darrell broke up Pantera, and yes, and Vinnie Paul is his brother.
Okay.
So, and then also there was some allegations that Gale made that said that
they were stealing his songs.
Darrell stole a song that he had written.
Yeah, the shooter, what was his name? Gale?
Yeah.
He was like super, from my understanding, he was like super delusional. Like
well, I think he was schizophrenic.
Yeah, and he had, he was kind of living in a different reality than the rest of us. And yeah, he was blaming the band members for a lot of things going on in his life, and they obviously had no, they didn't know what was going on in his life.
What's also really impressive is responding within 3 minutes to the 911 call made at 10:15. 7 police officers enter through the front entrance and move towards the stage within 3 minutes of the 911 call. And like I said, yes, now I know some other friends of mine that were there that said once the shooting took place, people were pushing people out onto that patio or outside. And then even once they're on the patio, people were helping people. Maybe they opened up the fence, maybe they couldn't, and some people were jumping the fence. But I just remember that there was a lot of people helping out to get people out of harm's way. But like I said, if this guy had more guns or more ammunition and the cops didn't get there, he was just going to keep killing people. I mean, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised. This guy was probably schizophrenic, but thank God that he didn't plan it out better, because if he would have, I mean, like I said, it could be 50 to 100 people murdered. So, and without that response time from the police officers. Well,
and he has some military training too, so Yeah, it was a horrible situation, but also one of those ones where you're like, thank God it wasn't worse than what it could have been.
Right.
So back to this Rawlins. So this next one's from our blog, actually. And while I do really appreciate the email that I got that we just went over, I actually prefer, if anybody out there, I prefer to direct people to the blog if they have a comment or a personal story about a case that we cover.
Well, what's interesting is it gives everybody else that listened to the story that's fascinated by that case a chance to hear that information.
Yes, and a chance to join in the conversation as well, because sometimes we get questions that are directed to you or I or both through email that we might not have the answers to. But if you put it on the blog, you might get somebody local from the area or local from the time frame that is able to add something to the story or shed some light on your question. This one's weird because it's similar. This is, my mother grew up in the area and graduated from Rawlins High School. She knew both Carlene Brown and Christy Gross. She says Carlene Brown and Christy Gross were not friends. They ran in different circles, but she knew them. Her comment when I mentioned the case to her last night at dinner was that they all knew about those two girls gone missing. But as far as she could tell, the local authorities kept the other two going missing very quiet. This is regarding the younger girls that went missing. They didn't want to freak out people, especially tourists. So that goes to what we were talking about Deborah Meyer's case. Well, Here we have a daughter of a local woman who says, yeah, she knew about it, but they kept it very quiet, especially, and she puts particularly Deborah's case, they kept very quiet.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear from people that lived in the area of these cases. I wish we heard more from them. So definitely, go to the blog if you in the area, even if you think it's something kind of silly. I mean, I've heard some of the most interesting things from our listeners.
Well, I love when people throw a theory out there.
Me too.
What about this? Or did anybody consider this? Or, and sometimes you can come up with a good theory in a particular case because of another case that you've heard of or studied and say, well, what does this apply here as well? But so a couple other things. She mentions that although hitchhiking was fairly common, the state penitentiary is located in Rawlins, which I didn't know that the state pen was in Rawlins. And she adds, folks around here have always been a little more weary about giving rides to strangers because the prison is located right there.
Right.
And then remember we had some, this was more of me complaining in episode 1, but there were two very different accounts of their vehicle situation with the first two victims, Carlene and Christy. One account was that their vehicle, their car, was found a long drive away in a place called Warland, a town called Warland. And then the other story regarding the same situation was that they were driving a van that day, and the van was later located at the rodeo grounds. Like like their vehicle didn't even leave that the place that they went, the fairgrounds.
I think the bullshit thing that we said was, is it a car or a van? And that's a big difference. For one,
this person on our blog says that her mother also said that the reports they all heard about the car was not found at either Warland or van found at the rodeo grounds, but rather their car had been found at Wagon Hound Rest Stop, which is between Rawlins and Laramie.
Right, so now we have a third account of what happened to the vehicle.
Right, but I like this one a little better just because it's somebody from the area from the time.
Right.
So interesting stuff there.
That's an interesting case. What episode numbers? Do you have those off the top of your...
I don't.
Off the top of your dome.
What, 275, I guess? I don't know.
I'm going to go look it up right now on my Stitcher app.
So maybe that little bit of information there, was a really interesting case to research and to cover on our show here, because it was one I had not heard of. Remember, I gave you some praise for bringing that one to the table, and you praised a listener for suggesting that case. It's one of those ones that when you read into it and when you look it up, when you study it, you're going, why isn't this like general knowledge? Why isn't this more well known throughout the true crime,
Yeah, 275, 274.
275, 274.
Episode numbers.
Yeah. So maybe going over those emails will inspire more people to come forward with information regarding that case and what was going on, or their speculation or rumors that they heard. I like hearing the rumors too, Captain, because I'm a firm believer that while I try to walk into it, take a rumor with a grain of salt type of situation, I also believe that, where there's smoke, sometimes there's fire. So sometimes there's truth in those rumors, especially ones that get handed down from generation to generation.
Right. Just like they say, there's a little truth in every joke.
There you go.